I think more broadly with MD&A, what we've seen is the material known trends and uncertainties. Those areas, given the macroeconomic environment we live in and the geopolitical changes that we live in, I think that's been the focus area.
Joining me today is Hiro Alimchandani, National Office Managing Director with Deloitte Touche. Hiro, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Matt.
Now, the SEC has been busy, as we all know. Broadly speaking, what are some of the overall priorities of the SEC, and what does the commission look like post-election?
Before I begin to answer the question, I do want to do my disclaimer, which is that any thoughts that I express today are my own and not those of Deloitte Touche. So please consult with a qualified advisor before you make any decisions. The overall three objectives of the SEC remain the same. They always talk about the mission. We think about the history of the SEC. It was formed in 1934 in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash in 1929. And it's been always set up with that three-part mission, which is to protect investors, to facilitate capital formation, and to maintain fair, efficient markets. Every chair has a slightly different approach of how they implement that three-part mission, but it's always that sort of three-part mission. So that's always important to keep in mind. Sometimes there's more focus on investor protection, and in other cases, there might be more facilitation of capital formation. We do know that under Chair Ueda, Acting Chair Ueda, there have been some accommodations that they've already announced for confidential or what we call non-public submissions. Some more types of filings are allowed. Now, the CorpFin just put out some guidance on this, a few days ago. So that's definitely an early indication, I would say, and that's something different. The other thing just to keep in mind when we think about the priorities, overall, the other three priorities, I would say, that have shifted from a rulemaking standpoint is the climate rule, obviously, that was supposed to get finalized. That climate rule, obviously, now is on hold. It's still going through the courts. And I think there was a speech that Mark Ueda put out where he essentially is asking for more time. And so I think, they want more time for deliberation given the changes in the SEC. So, that case will move forward at some point. It'll be interesting to see that, how that moves forward, because there are several attorneys general of various states that are also part of that. You think about New York and California that have, strong climate rules out there. The only other two things outside of climate I will mention is the crypto rules. Those are definitely, there's going to be a change and shift in the way they think about crypto. They've already rescinded the staff accounting bulletin, SAB 121, on safeguarding of crypto assets. So that's definitely, going to be changing. There was a roundtable that was held last week, I believe. So, we'll see where kind of crypto rulemaking also moves from that point. And the last point I'll say is they did talk about the PCOB and the effectiveness of the PCOB and how that's going to shape up as well under the new priorities of the SEC.
And what are some of the overall trends in the SEC review process? And are there any tips or best practices that you can provide to the audience when dealing with SEC comment letters?
Up until 2021, we had seen a decreasing trend, in terms of the average number of days that it would take to resolve a comment letter, or also an average number of comment letters per review cycle, so the back and forth rounds of comments. So that had been steadily going down. That, again, reversed in 2021-22 timeframe. A lot of that can be attributed to really the new number of public companies. There were more than 500 or many more public companies during the SPAC IPO boom that happened in 2020, 2021. So that clearly put a lot more stress and a lot more reviews that the SEC had to get through. So we did start to see way more comments trend up in that cycle. And I think 2023, 2024, it moderated a little bit more. But as always, we always tell companies, no matter what happens and changes in administration, the SEC is looking at their disclosures and they're still industry focused. And so they should be, always looking at those good disclosures to make sure that they're safeguarding their own selves, from that. So that's on the trends. I think the second part of your question was just tips on, when a company gets a comment letter. So I would say it's always great to actually reach out to the SEC if you're unclear about the comment. That's the first thing that you should think about. But don't ask an open-ended question, right? Like, okay, I got this comment letter, how should I respond? You have to have a little bit of what you sort of propose and maybe start telling them what you're thinking about doing, but don't expect a clearance on the phone because several people look at the response from you as a company, so they can't clear it on the phone. They always want those responses in writing. But if you're unclear about a question or not sure what the SEC wants, it's always good to call and have a gut check, and it's always helpful to do that. So then when you start to draft your responses, I think it's really important to first take a look at any timing considerations. I always say many times we get comments on day 3 of your vacation. That's typically what happens with these kinds of things. So I think if you have any timing concerns, asking for an extension, is sometimes possible. And so that's something you should really first think about how much time you would need, because otherwise you need to respond in 10 business days. You have to respond to all the parts of the question. Many times SEC's questions have 6 sub-bullets. So I would go sub-bullet by sub-bullet and respond to all parts of the question. I think that's really important. And assembling a good working group of individuals from your financial reporting group, technical accounting group, SEC reporting, your lawyers, in-house counsel, external SEC counsel, and your auditors. So getting everybody together is important to come up with what the response should be, and pulling all the technical memos and documentation, because when you made those judgments during the years, it's important that you had contemporaneous documentation and memos. So now is the time to bring it all together rather than writing it for the first time. So if you were already for that question, that's the time to pull all that in together. And then don't just cite the guidance. That's one of my other pet peeves is like the SEC knows what their guidance is. They know GAAP very well also. So don't just spend half a page citing the guidance, but actually apply it to your facts. So I think that would be important. And then the last thing I'll mention is like tone and attitude is important, to have a respectful tone and attitude, because the SEC only can see what's in writing. They're not having a discussion with you. They're reading your filings just based on writing. So sometimes the context is hard to get from that. And then also making sure your first response is your best response.
And lastly, what are some of the recent trends in terms of topics frequently commented on for all industries? And then what about maybe more specifically for real estate?
So there's a little bit of crossover between both, but if we first take the common letter trends for all industries, the top 10 areas of comments usually stay the same. I think all the accounting firms and law firms have some sort of a publication that goes through what are the top common areas. I would say 70 to 80% of them stay the same. Maybe there might be 2 or 3 different topics, subtopics that might change, but in the broad category of topics, they stay the same. Sometimes they might focus on specific subtopics within a category, but the overall category is the same. So one of the big areas is MD&A, for example. That's the best, the biggest one. Non-GAAP measures is another one. I'm probably the only crazy person that tries to keep track between who's winning the race between non-GAAP and MD&A. This time, I think, as of 2024 cycle, MD&A seems to have won that race. But so MD&A is a much broader topic. Obviously, the SEC always reminds companies that MD&A should be written from the eyes of management. And so that's been a focus area. In each of the 3 subsections of MD&A, companies get a lot of comments on results of operations, liquidity and capital resources, and also critical accounting estimates. So those are the 3 main topic areas within that. But I think more broadly with MD&A, what we've seen is the material known trends and uncertainties. Those areas, given the macroeconomic environment we live in, and the geopolitical changes that we live in, I think that's been the focus area. I'll just switch to real estate. I think similarly, there's been a lot of eyes on real estate, on our industry, and commercial real estate, especially since COVID. And there is a lot of back to office happening, but it's still not the same as pre-COVID level. So I think both the banking industry and the SEC is very focused on commercial real estate. Lot of different speeches on commercial real estate. And for banking, it's important because they want to see how much of their portfolio is tied to kind of riskier assets, whether it's commercial assets or suburban office or office assets, because that's really important for them to look at. So a lot of liquidity questions and a lot of leasing type questions, what's your tenant rollover? What's your debt maturity schedule looking like? Any covenants that you've not met or you've breached? All those areas become really important operationally and from a liquidity perspective as far as real estate is concerned. So that's the big area for MD&A. And then moving on to non-GAAP measures, I would say That one is, again, continues to be a big area. Almost every comment letter I see has non-GAAP measures included. And I think non-GAAP measures, obviously prominence being the big thing, they want to be sure that the non-GAAP is not more prominent than the GAAP. And that's not just in words and bullet points and in narrative disclosures, but also in pictures, diagrams, anywhere but in the filing essentially. So that's always important.